Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist? Canadian Political Parties. So today's episode was requested by Samuel Hatch on YouTube. If you want me to do an episode on another country's political parties, please either comment it down below or send me an email, and I'll get around to it at some point. I currently have requests to do an episode on British parties, Portuguese parties, Russian parties, which I'm going to try to complete before the election in September, French territorial politics, Spanish parties, which I think I'll break down into 2 episodes, and then Indian political parties, which I think I'll break down into 3 episodes. So Canada has several important political divisions I could talk about. There is a division between West and East Canada, poor and rich people in Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, white and non-white, urban and rural. But I'd say one of the most important in politics today is the division between English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians. Most Canadians speak English, but in the province of Quebec there is a large French-speaking population. There's always existed some tension between English and French-speaking Canadians since Britain conquered New France in the 18th century. I could talk for a very, very long time about why this tension and hostility exist, but for the purposes of this episode, I'll just say the main thing that gets French speakers, often known as Quebecois, and English speakers to yell at each other largely seems to center around the fact that both sides believe the other really holds no respect for them and is actively working to either assimilate them against their will or is trying to impose their laws, culture, and customs onto them. This creates many problems for the political parties and the political establishment in the country, both in forming a ruling coalition or ruling party that usually tries to appease both groups, but also in projecting Canada as this happy, tolerant land which, if you listen to some of the more obnoxious liberal types in both America and Canada, is a literal heaven on earth. So Canada's main legislative body is the House of Commons. It is 338 MPs, or members of Parliament, who are elected from 338 electoral districts, or ridings, spread all throughout Canada. MPs are elected via first-past-the-post from each district. So, if you wanted to become an MP, you and your party would have to run against other MP candidates who live in your district, and you would have to get the most votes to get elected. You would need a majority of the vote, but you at least need more votes than every other candidate, and whoever got the most votes would then become an MP. In the last election in 2019, a candidate won with only 28% of the vote, but it was more than everyone else, so they were elected. The House of Commons raise rules and regulations, and will also elect the Prime Minister of Canada and their cabinet. The other legislative body in Canada is the Senate, which acts as the upper house. The Senate is very weak, not really talked about a whole lot, and it seems to be undergoing a process of removing partisan labels from it, so I'm not really going to talk about it. All I'll really say is the Senate is made up of 105 senators, who are appointed by the Prime Ministers of Canada. Canada also is a federation, made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. In case you're wondering what the difference is between a province and a territory, the territories have less representation in the Senate, have a very small population, are found in the north of the country, and have a very large Indigenous community in them. Also, the territories of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, which, funnily enough, is not actually the most northwest of all the territories, both don't have partisan governments, so no political parties for local elections. Meanwhile, the provinces in the Yukon Territory do have partisan governments, so they will have political parties present in them for local elections. Now, in most normal countries, political parties at the federal and regional level usually will be directly linked. However, in quirky Canada, this is not the case, with provincial parties often being distinctive entities from their federal counterparts. Sometimes this distinction is small, like in Ontario, where the Ontarian Liberals are closely connected to the Liberal Party of Canada, the Ontario Conservatives are closely connected to the Conservative Party of Canada, and the NDP of Ontario is closely connected to the federal NDP. However, when looking at other provinces, like British Columbia, it gets a little bit more tricky, with the British Columbia Liberal Party being a combination of Liberals and Conservatives who are opposed to NDP rule. Quebec is probably the wildest of the provinces. You have the Quebec Liberals, who are pretty much everyone opposed to increased separatism between Quebec and Canada, the CAQ, who are a mix of right-wing Quebec nationalists and conservatives, QS, a left-wing nationalist and progressive party, and the Parti Québécois, a straight-up separatist party for the Quebecois. Finally, one last thing before I start talking about the parties. Canada is often described as a two-party plus system. This means that there are two main parties who dominate Canadian politics, the Liberals and the Conservatives, along with several other smaller parties who may dominate on a regional level and hold some influence in federal politics, but really remain small. All prime ministers in Canada have belonged to either the Liberal or Conservative Party, and they are often thought of as the only real parties who hold a serious chance at running the country. It can be debated why this is the case, but generally I'd say the first past the post electoral laws that favor broad centrist parties, the resources and money the two main parties are able to wield, and even just the self-perpetuating idea that they are the only two parties that really have a shot of winning, have all led to this two-party plus political system. Okay, now let's start talking about the parties. First off, we have the ruling party, the Liberal Party of Canada, or in French, Parti libéral du Canada. The party is liberal, and there are kind of two ways you can look at it ideologically. First, there is the more American way, which is to say that the Liberals are left of its main opposition, the Conservatives, and therefore they are a left-wing party. The second is the more European way, which is to say that liberalism is an ideology, is moderate and generally centrist, and there are several parties in Canada that sit left of the Liberals, so therefore they are a centrist party. Regardless of both opinions, the Liberals in Canada are considered to be quite similar to the Democrats in America, arguing for socially liberal policies. The Liberals get a lot of support among middle-class urban Canadians, who tend to be younger and college-educated, especially among those in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and to a lesser extent, even places like Quebec City, Calgary, or Winnipeg. They also tend to do very well in Eastern Canada, in the Maritime Provinces and Ontario, and in the Territories. The Liberals currently have 155 MPs, and Liberal-like parties currently control the provinces of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, along with the Yukon Territory. The current head of the Liberals is Justin Trudeau, who, if you know any Canadian politician, it's probably him. He is the current Prime Minister of the country, running it in a minority government, and is an MP from Quebec. The Liberals believe in many progressive social policies, like backing gun control, supporting the LGBTQ community, favors higher immigration, wants to make life easier for disabled Canadians, wants to legalize cannabis and euthanasia, and supports taking a more critical look at Canadian history. They tend to favor higher taxes and more regulations in regards to economic and environmental policy, although they definitely aren't anti-capitalist and still support a free market or mixed economy. Since Trudeau came into power, it has pushed further left on many issues, such as wanting to fight very, very hard against climate change, supports carbon taxes, backs multiculturalism in society, supports a strong welfare state, and has fought for increased affordable housing. It also favors a nonpartisan Senate, favors autonomy for Quebec, I'd argue sometimes pushes for soft Canadian nationalism, and favors Canada's involvement in NATO, although it has tried to regulate Canada to a more support role within the organization. The Liberals pushing further left has put them at odds with some in Canada, with many seeing them as hypocrites or spineless. For example, in 2019, it was found that Trudeau had worn blackface when he was in college, something that doesn't really mesh well with their pro-diversity, racism isn't tolerated here stance. There's been a sense among the left, and even among some on the right, that Liberals, while they talk a lot about protecting the planet and disadvantaged groups, they don't really do a whole lot to carry out these policies, and are too soft or weak-willed to actually implement some of the more sweeping and impactful policies they claim to care so much about. For some, the Liberals care just about the good press they receive from the progressive media and virtue signaling. Also, the Trudeau government has experienced a decent amount of corruption scandals, although I'd argue it's not as bad as some of the corruption scandals we have talked about in South Africa or Bulgaria. The next major party is the Conservative Party of Canada, or Parti conservateur du Canada. The Conservatives are conservative. The Conservatives are pretty much the only right-wing party in Canada worth talking about, at least at the federal level, and because of this they encompass a pretty wide range of beliefs. Most conservative supporters are simply conservative, but you can also find right-wing populists, libertarians, members of the Christian right, right-leaning moderates, and even some ex-liberals present in the party. The party gets a lot of support among the rural population, especially in Western Anglophone-speaking provinces, like Alberta or Saskatchewan. Older and more religious voters also tend to back the party, and while not dominant in suburban areas, they can often hold their own. The Conservatives hold 119 seats in the House, and Conservative or Conservative-like parties control the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward's Island. The right-leaning CAQ also controls Quebec, so debatedly you could say Conservatives hold that province as well. The current head of the Conservatives is Erin O'Toole, an MP from Ontario and the current leader of the opposition. The Conservatives can be seen as the inverse of the Liberals. They tend to support more socially conservative policies, often being skeptical of progressive social movements, support gun rights, backs tough on crime laws, and is supportive of traditional Canadian narratives on history. It favors lower taxes and less regulations, being strongly supportive of the free market, likes privatization, and is supportive of free trade agreements. Within the Conservative Party, you can find members who argue for a stricter immigration policy, less environmental regulations, and wants to reduce access to abortion. But the official mainline within the Conservative Party is keeping the status quo on these issues. It also tends to be a strong backer of federalism in Canada, is pro-NATO, pro-Israeli, wants to be tougher on China, favors a stronger military, is a strong supporter of the oil industry in the country, and backs an elected Senate. Now the big problem the Conservatives face tends to lie in the big tent nature of the party. With it having so many different right-wing ideologies fall under the Conservative umbrella, often the party is constantly fighting between those that want a more principled Conservative Party and those that want a more moderate party. Recent infighting has led to the formation of a breakoff party, the People's Party in 2018, that is believed to have cost the Conservatives a couple seats in the last election. A more serious bout of infighting in the 90s led to the predecessor of the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservatives, to have a fight with the more principled Conservative breakoff, the Reform Party, which ultimately led to almost 15 years of Liberal rule in Canada. You can also find people just disliking the Conservatives just because they feel they are too socially conservative, don't take climate change very seriously, and or are a party for rich businessmen and corporations. So those were the major parties, but there are a couple more parties who are significant. The third largest party in the House is the Bloc Quebecois, or the Quebecer Bloc. The party, unlike other parties, only operates in the province of Quebec, with it hoping for Quebec to leave Canada and become its own country. It gets most of its support among French-speaking Canadians, specifically among the white French speakers, and to a much lesser extent, among some Haitian and Arab Canadians. Its support base often fluctuates and is very diverse, with the party holding a large number of both urban and rural voters, and gets support among working-class Quebecers, along with more conservative Quebecers. The party holds 32 seats in the House, and is closely connected with the provincial Parti Quebecois. The party is currently headed by Yves-François Blanchet, an MP from Quebec, and was formerly the Minister of Environment in Quebec. The Bloc is in favor of a referendum on Quebec's independence, and opposes what they see as attempts by the federal government, which they see as an Anglophone-dominated government, to impose their laws on them. It wants to promote Quebec and local industries over wider Canadian industries, is supportive of other separatist groups around the world and the right to self-determination, opposes both the Senate and the monarchy in Canada, and strongly promotes the French language in Quebec. It is generally a left-leaning party, with it favoring environmentalism, opposes a free market economy, hoping for a mixed or social market economy, and tends to be supportive of progressive social movements. However, it also has a right-wing base, which means it supports a very nationalistic way of viewing the Quebecois, and often argues for reduced immigration into Quebec, arguing that those who do immigrate should be assimilated into wider Quebecois society. This more assimilationist view has led some to deem the Bloc, or maybe just Quebec nationalists in general, as racist. One very controversial law, the secularism law, has led to a lot of criticism. This law essentially banned religious symbols for public officials, which led to people accusing the Quebec nationalists, like the Bloc, of attempting to make life harder for devout Muslim women, which is one of the groups the bill would have targeted. Another infamous example is when Quebec narrowly voted against separatism in a referendum in the 90s, and one nationalist leader said that only, quote, money and the ethnic vote prevented Quebec independence. All this has led to people, particularly Anglophones, to accuse the Quebec nationalists as ethnic separatist and racist, while the Quebec nationalists have argued that they just want to protect their identity. Next we go to the New Democratic Party, or Nouveau Parti Démocratique, or NDP. The NDP sits left of the Liberals, with it representing progressives, social democrats, and some democratic socialists. It tends to act more as a pressure group on the federal level, and has only managed to become the official opposition once. It tends to be supported by a combination of trade unionists, young college-educated voters, indigenous communities, and among some urban areas like Edmonton, Vancouver, Essex, Saskatoon, and St. John's. It often gets most of its support in the western provinces and in the territories. It and its predecessor, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, historically did very well among rural voters upset with the economic conditions they found themselves in, but this has diminished over time. The party currently has 24 seats in the House, and is the ruling party in British Columbia. The NDP in Yukon, while not running the territory, do play a supply and confidence role to the Liberals, giving them some influence. The party is currently headed by Jagmeet Singh, an MP from British Columbia, and formerly a member of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. The NDP holds many similar values to the Liberals, such as supporting progressive social movements, backing more taxes and more regulations, and wanting to do more to confront climate change. However, the NDP often argues for a more principled approach, often arguing against compromises. So they believe in greatly expanding both the healthcare and welfare sector. They want to reduce the amount of tax breaks rich companies and millionaires often use to avoid paying taxes, argues for greater rights and protections for Indigenous Canadians, wants Canada to be net carbon free by 2030, and wants to make it easier for refugees to enter the country. It also backs efforts to make housing and education more affordable, wants greater regulations on entertainment companies like Netflix and Facebook, supports lowering the voting age to 16, and wants a proportional electoral system. The NDP has always struggled on a federal level to win elections. Many people on the left in Canada tend to vote Liberal, because while they might not agree with the Liberals about everything, they can agree with them in most part on most things. And they fear not voting Liberal will result in the Conservatives coming to power, which is the worst case scenario for them. As the Liberals under Trudeau have moved in a more progressive direction, it makes it harder for the NDP to present itself as a serious and viable alternative, as more and more people feel that the NDP is unable to present a good vision that distinguishes them from the Liberals. And our last party we will talk about is the Green Party of Canada, or Parti Vert du Canada. The Greens support green politics, meaning they believe in environmentalism, grassroots democracy, and broadly progressive ideals. The Greens are very small compared to previous parties. In the last election, it only won 6.5% of the vote, with most of that vote being concentrated on Vancouver Island, the city of Victoria, the rural area north of Vancouver, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward's Island. It tends to get support among the more disillusioned left-wing voters in the country, who feel none of the parties really represent them, and has led to the Green Party holding a more populist kind of ideology. The party currently has 2 seats in the House. No province in Canada is under Green rule, but the Greens are the main opposition party in Prince Edward's Island, and are present in the BC, Ontario, and the New Brunswick legislatures. The party is currently headed by Annamie Paul, a progressive activist from Ontario. The Greens tend to focus on environmental issues. They want to cut down on greenhouse gases in Canada, support infrastructure and building projects designed to make Canada more sustainable, oppose subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, wants to invest more in tourism, wants to increase the use of the military to combat environmental disasters, and opposes exporting fresh water from Canada to other parts of the world. It opposes first-past-the-post voting, but doesn't really state what should be the alternative. It also supports greater Indigenous rights, supports progressive social movements, and wants to increase foreign aid spending. The Greens face a lot of similar problems the NDP faces, with people choosing to vote for the more realistic option. It is especially hard for the Greens because the NDP is the more established third party, and has proven, at least on the regional level, that it can govern. So people often look first to the NDP before them. The Greens, on the other hand, have never led a regional government in Canada, and still are seen by many as just outsiders. This has partially benefited the Greens, as people upset with the system do see them as underdogs, and the Greens have seen their numbers in regional elections constantly gone up. However, they still are a long way off from forming a government, as many still see them as just a strange fringe party. The Greens also recently have suffered with infighting. 1/3 of all Green MPs, or in other words 1 person, left the party earlier this year over a dispute over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict between the MP and party leader Paul. So those are the 5 main Canadian political parties. As stated earlier, Canada has what is known as a 2-party plus system that makes the Liberals and Conservatives very important, and all the other parties far more weak. Although with Trudeau's minority government, these smaller third parties have been playing a fairly important role in the country. If you want to learn more about Canadian politics, I'd recommend looking at JJ McColl's channel on YouTube. He makes some pretty good videos on Canadian politics, although Quebecers hate him, so just keep that in mind. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. thank you for watching. If you were listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever, I have put a series of maps on my website that kind of detail the election results from the last election, and that can help show where some of the parties are present. If you're on YouTube, you would have seen them on screen, but also if you want, you can just go to my website and look at them there. You can save it, you can download them. But yeah, next video is going to be British parties, and then I'll do Bolivia, and then depending on when I get done with Bolivia, I'll either do Portuguese or Russian parties. We'll just have to see. But thank you for watching. If you want to get in contact with me, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.